Imagine the most daring prison break in American history. Not just a man slipping away in the dark, but stealing the very symbol of his captor's power, then sailing it directly into the arms of the enemy to gain freedom for his family and himself. Now imagine this man was a slave who then became a Union war hero, a state legislator, a U.S. congressman, and the owner of the very house he was once enslaved in. The year is 1862. The place is Charleston, South Carolina, the heartland of the Confederacy. The Civil War is raging, and the Union blockade is choking the life out of the southern ports. Every resource is strained, and every man, free or enslaved, is crucial to the war effort. Robert Smalls, a man who possessed a quiet intelligence and an uncanny skill on the water, was one of the latter. Smalls was not a field hand. Born into slavery in 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina, he was a house servant in his early years, a position that, while still bondage, afforded him exposure to the white world his peers never knew. He was sent to Charleston at the age of 12 and quickly became a waterman, learning the intricate, shallow waterways, the tidal rhythms, and the navigational lights of Charleston Harbor like the back of his hand. By the time he was 21, he was a wheelman, a pilot, on a Confederate transport vessel, the CSS Planter. The Confederate Navy officially listed him as an able seaman, but in reality he was the ship's unacknowledged master of navigation. The white officers trusted him implicitly. After all, where would a slave go with a massive, slow-moving steamer? This trust was the flaw in the Confederate armor. The audacious theft of the Planter. The Planter was an 87-ton paddle-wheel steamer armed with a 32-pound pivot gun. Her mission was to serve as a dispatch boat and a transport for Confederate supplies and troops operating under the very nose of the Union fleet anchored just outside the harbor. Smalls saw the ship not as a prison, but as a potential vehicle for liberation. For weeks, he and the other enslaved crew members, men who shared his silent desperation for freedom, had been planning. They discussed the tides, the signal codes, the positioning of the guns, and the incredible, almost suicidal risk they were about to take. The plan was set for Monday, May 12, 1862. On that fateful evening, the Planter was tied up at a wharf in Charleston. The three white Confederate officers, in a display of what can only be called supreme arrogance and complacency, decided to spend the night ashore. They left the ship, handing the command over to the enslaved crew. This wasn't an unusual practice. They never once imagined the crew would betray them. As soon as the officers were gone, Smalls put his plan into motion. He had arranged for his wife Hannah, his two young children, and other family members and friends of the crew, a total of 16 people, including 5 women and 3 children, to gather at a prearranged location. The fear must have been paralyzing. Capture meant instant execution for the men and a life of brutal, inescapable bondage for the women and the children. In the dead of night, the enslaved family slipped through the darkened streets of Charleston, bundled onto another small boat, and were rowed to a wharf near the ship. Smalls watched from the deck of the Planter until he saw the signal. A light briefly flashed from the landing. He gave a quiet order. The steam was raised. At 3 a.m. on May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls steered the Planter away from the wharf. The gauntlet of the Confederate forts. The most perilous part of the journey was navigating past the heavily fortified Confederate positions. He had to pilot the large steamer directly past Fort Sumter, the fortress that fired the first shots of the war, and which represented the unyielding might of the Confederacy. He had to pass within 100 yards of its cannon muzzles. This is where Small's intimate knowledge of the harbor became their greatest weapon. He knew the routine, the speed, and the secret code signals required to pass the harbor's 5 checkpoints undetected. As the Planter chugged through the darkness, Smalls, wearing the white captain's straw hat to complete the disguise, took the wheel. His movements were a perfect mimicry of the white captain's. As they approached Fort Sumter, Smalls slowed the ship, letting the steam whistle give 2 long blasts and 1 short one, the exact Confederate signal for an authorized vessel. He stood at the wheel, his posture rigid, his face grimly determined, perfectly simulating the captain's familiar swagger. The silence of the crew was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic churn of the paddle wheel. The Confederate sentries, sleepy and unconcerned, saw a large steamer, heard the correct signal, and saw a figure in a captain's hat on the bridge. They waved the ship through. The Confederate transport Planter, carrying a fortune in armaments and a cargo of human contraband, had just been surrendered to the enemy by a slave. Once they were safely past the final fort, Fort Moultrie, and clear of the harbor, Smalls had his men hoist a white bedsheet as an improvised flag of surrender. They were in the open sea, just a few miles from the Union blockade fleet. The first Union vessel to spot the approaching steamer was the USS Onward. When the Union sailors saw a Confederate warship steaming right towards them, they prepared to open fire. The crew of the Planter, fearing a deadly volley, rushed below deck, but Smalls refused to leave the wheel. He steered his stolen vessel directly towards the Onward, forcing the Union captain to hold his fire as the ship got closer and the right flag became visible. When the Planter finally docked, Smalls stepped forward and, according to historical accounts, presented the ship to the astonished Union officers with the words, "I am Robert Smalls, and I have brought you this warship and all the guns in her." The intelligence Smalls provided was invaluable. He detailed the Confederate fortifications, including the location of mines and torpedoes in the harbor, which immediately gave the Union a critical military advantage. The Planter herself was a significant prize. The ship was fully loaded with 4 pieces of artillery, 200 pounds of ammunition, and a large quantity of military dispatches and maps, all delivered right into Union hands. The Union Navy quickly converted the Planter into a gunboat, retaining Smalls as a pilot. Word of the incredible feat spread like wildfire. In the North, Robert Smalls became an instant sensation, a living symbol of the enslaved population's willingness to fight for their own freedom and a propaganda coup for the Union war effort. Northern newspapers hailed him as a hero, and Congress, in an immediate and unprecedented move, passed a bill granting Smalls and his crew the full prize money from the captured vessel. Smalls received an impressive $1,500, a considerable sum for the time. From steamboat pilot to captain in the Navy. Smalls did not rest on his laurels. He immediately enlisted in the Union Navy as a pilot, using his unparalleled knowledge of the South Carolina coast to guide Union vessels through the treacherous, shallow waters around Beaufort and Charleston. His bravery was legendary. During a crucial engagement at the Battle of Folly Island Creek in 1863, the white captain of the Planter became terrified under heavy fire and abandoned his post, hiding in the coal bunker. Smalls, without hesitation, took command of the ship, steering her out of the engagement and saving the entire crew and vessel. His actions were so heroic and undeniable that a few months later, in a time when a black man was not allowed to command a U.S. vessel, Robert Smalls was officially promoted to captain of the Planter, a position he held for the remainder of the war. He was perhaps the first black captain of a U.S. military vessel in American history. His war service was not just a side story, it was a testament to his character. He took part in 17 major naval engagements, constantly putting his life on the line to destroy the very system that had once held him in chains. From war hero to American statesman. After the war, Smalls returned to his birthplace, Beaufort, South Carolina, a free man, a hero, and a man of significant means and influence. He was now a respected figure in a nation struggling to define its future, specifically the rights of the 4 million newly freed people. Robert Smalls, the former slave, stepped directly onto the stage of Reconstruction-era American politics. His story is a vital illustration of how quickly and effectively freedmen sought to use their new rights and power. He realized that political power was the only true guarantee of freedom. The Black Fortunes and the house of his bondage. One of the most powerful symbols of his new status involved his old life. Before the war, Smalls's owner, Henry McKee, had bought a house on Prince Street in Beaufort. This was the very house where Smalls's mother was once held and where Smalls himself lived as a young man. After the war, with the McKee family deeply in debt, the house went up for sale at a tax auction. Robert Smalls bought the house in 1863. He paid the full price and moved his family into the home where his freedom had once been denied, a profound and deeply personal act of justice and reclaiming his past. A pioneering political career. Smalls realized that the promise of freedom would be hollow without the power to vote and legislate. He quickly became a leader in the nascent Republican Party in South Carolina, the party of Lincoln that was committed to Reconstruction and equal rights. South Carolina State House of Representatives, 1868 to 1870. He was one of the many African American men elected to the state legislature during Reconstruction. Here, he worked tirelessly to establish a public school system that would serve both black and white children, a revolutionary concept in the former slave state. South Carolina State Senate, 1870 to 1874. His influence grew, and he helped draft the state's new constitution. Critically, he pushed for the creation of Beaufort County's public school system, believing that universal education was the engine of true equality. United States House of Representatives, 1875 to 1879, and 1882 to 1887. Smalls was elected to the U.S. Congress, where he served 5 non-consecutive terms. He advocated for civil rights, for the protection of black voters from domestic terrorism, and for economic development. His presence on Capitol Hill was a powerful daily rebuke to the former Confederates who desperately sought to roll back the clock on freedom. The fight against Jim Crow. Small's political life was not easy. He was a beacon of the brief, brilliant experiment of Reconstruction, and the forces of white supremacy relentlessly targeted him. He faced constant violence, intimidation, and political corruption aimed at unseating him. His career was interrupted by the Compromise of 1877, a political deal that led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and ushering in the brutal era of Jim Crow segregation. Smalls was one of the last black congressmen to hold office from the Deep South for decades. Despite the tide of reaction, he continued to fight. In the 1990s, when the white Democratic Redeemers rewrote the South Carolina Constitution to effectively disenfranchise black voters through literacy tests and poll taxes, Smalls was one of the loudest dissenting voices. He stood on the floor of the convention and delivered a powerful, moving speech that served as a final, eloquent plea for justice, warning the state of the moral and economic ruin that segregation would bring. His final major political post was as the collector of customs for the Port of Beaufort, a lucrative and powerful federal position he held intermittently until 1913. It was a post of symbolic power, overseeing the same port he had liberated himself from 50 years earlier. The lasting legacy. Robert Small's life, which ended in 1915 in the same house he had purchased, is a masterclass in American audacity and persistence. His story is far more than an exciting war tale. It is a profound lesson in American history, illustrating several key, surprising truths. The agency of the enslaved. The escape of the planter proves that enslaved people were not passive victims. They were active agents of their own liberation, willing to risk everything to seize freedom. The forgotten founding of black political power. Smalls was a foundational figure in American governance. He didn't just vote, he helped draft the state constitution, build the public school system, and served in the national legislature, demonstrating the immediate and sophisticated political capacity of the freedmen population during the window of Reconstruction. A unique Union hero. Small's contribution to the Civil War was strategic and immediate. He didn't just fight, he gave the Union command a strategic blueprint of the Confederate defenses in one of the most important ports in the South. Robert Smalls remains an unsung hero whose story encapsulates the darkest failures and the most incredible promises of the American experiment. He was the slave who stole a warship, commanded a Navy boat, purchased his former master's house, and served in the United States Congress. He was a black man in a Confederate captain's hat who stared down the enemy's most powerful fort and sailed right past it, changing the course of his life, his family's lives, and, in a small but indelible way, the history of the entire nation. His journey from the wheelhouse of a stolen Confederate ship to the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives is the kind of true story that could only happen in America. A story so improbable it must be true, and so informative it must be remembered. The period immediately following Robert Small's political career in the late 1880s and 1990s saw the definitive end of Reconstruction and the establishment of the Jim Crow era. This was a major, tragic turning point in U.S. history, as the successes and promises of the Reconstruction period were systematically dismantled. Here are a few key events that define what came next. Disenfranchisement of black voters. South states, including Small's own South Carolina, revised their state constitutions to strip African Americans of their voting rights. This was achieved through various legal mechanisms like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, which were designed to appear neutral but were applied unfairly and disproportionately to black citizens. Smalls witnessed this rollback in his own state with the revised 1895 Constitution. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. This landmark Supreme Court case essentially codified racial segregation as the law of the land. It upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate equal doctrine, providing the legal foundation for Jim Crow laws for the next half-century. The Great Migration begins early 1900s. As economic and political opportunities vanished in the South due to Jim Crow, millions of African Americans began moving north and west to major cities. This massive demographic shift, known as the Great Migration, began in earnest and would fundamentally change the social and cultural geography of the United States over the next several decades. The next U.S. president. Robert Small's final non-consecutive term in the House of Representatives ended in 1887. The next president to take office was Grover Cleveland, who began his second non-consecutive term in 1893. However, the president immediately after his last term ended in 1887 was Benjamin Harrison, who served from 1889 to 1893. A surprising fact about Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd U.S. president, is that he was the grandson of the 9th president, William Henry Harrison. He was also the last president to have a full beard while in office. His administration was responsible for significant legislative achievements, including the Sherman Antitrust Act and the push for federal support of public education and voting rights for Black Americans, although his efforts to pass a federal elections bill to protect Black voters in the South ultimately failed. Imagine you are living in the United States in the early 1920s. You've just witnessed the dizzying victory of World War I, the sudden death of your heroes from the Spanish flu, and the birth of a terrifying new culture, celebrity-driven mass media. Nothing stays a secret anymore, and the public is hungry for spectacle. But what if the biggest spectacle of the decade was a story so bizarre it sounded like science fiction? A tale of glowing women, poisoned teeth, and a deadly industrial cover-up that would rewrite safety laws forever?
This is the story of the Radium Girls, and it began with a glow. The dawn of the Undark Age. The clock faces of the 1910s and 1920s were special. They did not need a lamp to tell the time in a dark movie theater or a battlefield trench. They glowed. The luminous paint used was called Undark, and its secret ingredient was the most miraculous yet little understood element of the new century: radium. Discovered by Marie Curie, radium was hailed as a wonder element. It was used in everything from tonic water and toothpaste to cosmetics and children's toys, all marketed with promises of vitality and eternal health. Radium was expensive, rare, and considered a symbol of luxury, modernity, and scientific progress. At the heart of the Undark industry was the U.S. Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, and its later branches in Ottawa, Illinois. Here, hundreds of young women, most in their late teens and early 20s, were employed as dial painters. The work was painstaking, requiring tiny, meticulous strokes to paint the numbers and hands of watches, aircraft instruments, and military dials. The only way to get a sufficiently fine point on their camel hair brushes was for the girls to perform a technique called lip pointing or tipping. They would twist the brush tip between their lips to achieve a needle-sharp point before dipping it back into the paint. The paint, of course, was radium. The women were told the luminous paint was harmless, and some were even encouraged to play with the glowing substance. They painted their fingernails with it, brushed it onto their eyelids for a spectacular, shimmering look before their dates, and even sprinkled the dust on their clothes. They were the original ghost girls, walking home at night, leaving trails of faint green light behind them. They felt modern, special, and well-paid, earning 3 times the average factory wage for a woman at the time. But the glow was a death sentence. The invisible killer. Radium is 1 million times more radioactive than the same amount of uranium. When ingested, it behaves chemically like calcium, the element our body craves for bone strength. When the women put the radium-laced brush to their lips, they were ingesting tiny but lethal doses of a substance that the body welcomed and immediately began depositing directly into their bones, teeth, and jaws. The U.S. Radium Corporation was perfectly aware of the danger. The owners, the chemists, and the male executives wore lead aprons and handled the radium only with tongs and protective screens. Yet they not only allowed the lip-pointing practice to continue, but actively promoted it to increase efficiency, repeatedly telling the girls the substance was perfectly safe. The initial symptoms were terrifying and mystifying. It began with aching joints, anemia, and fatigue, symptoms easily dismissed as rheumatism or exhaustion. Then came the first horrific sign, the jawbone necrosis, later dubbed radium jaw. The radium, concentrated in the bone, was silently dissolving the girls' mandibles and maxillae from the inside out. Teeth would loosen and fall out without warning. When dentists attempted to pull an aching tooth, the entire jawbone often came away with it. The women's mouths would develop gruesome ulcers, and their breath was said to smell like decomposition. The most macabre detail? The decaying bone tissue, saturated with radium, visibly glowed in the dark. The curious case of the radium ducks. As the women began to die, their deaths were initially misdiagnosed. The corporation was careful to list the cause as syphilis, a common and embarrassing diagnosis at the time, or some other non-industrial disease. The doctors working for the company backed these falsified reports. The first significant death was that of Molly Maggia in 1922, who died an agonizing death after her entire lower jaw had deteriorated and she had suffered a terrible hemorrhage. Her case, along with several others, should have been a red flag. But a systematic cover-up of epic proportions was already in full swing. The corporation, however, could not control every body on the planet. This is where the story takes its most surprising turn, involving a bizarre scientific investigation that had to prove the unthinkable, that a human body could become a deadly, glowing time bomb. Dr. Harrison Martland, a forensic pathologist, was the man who finally exposed the true nature of the poison. He needed undeniable proof that the deaths were caused by radium and that the radiation remained active in the bodies long after death. His key piece of evidence, which shocked the scientific community and the media, was the concept of the radium duck. Martland devised an experiment to demonstrate the terrifying persistence of the element. He took ducks, fed them minute amounts of radium, and observed their fate. He proved that even years after the ducks were exposed, their bones remained highly radioactive. Furthermore, he demonstrated the effects of the ingested radium on their bone tissue, matching the necrosis seen in the women. But more incredibly, Martland conducted a macabre experiment on the remains of one of the deceased dial painters. Using an early, powerful Geiger counter and a photograph taken in a completely darkened room, he showed that the woman's bones were still intensely luminous, giving off a distinct radioactive glow. He was able to prove that the women were literally being eaten alive from the inside out by the element they had been licking off their brushes. His work conclusively linked the glowing bones, the decaying jaws, and the sudden epidemic of illness to the deliberate actions of the U.S. Radium Corporation. The 5 pickets and the trial of the century. The story moves from the laboratory to the courtroom in 1927. 5 of the most severely afflicted women, including Grace Fryer, who was so crippled by the bone disintegration that she had to wear a steel brace, decided to sue the U.S. Radium Corporation. They became known in the press as the Radium Girls, or the 5 Pickets, a name used by a journalist for its alliterative appeal. The odds were stacked against them. The company was wealthy and powerful, delaying the case with every legal maneuver possible, counting on the fact that the women were all terminally ill. The company's strategy was simple: wait for them to die. But the media had turned this into a cause celeb. Newspapers ran sensational headlines juxtaposing the women's youth and beauty with their horrifying condition. The coverage, while sometimes exploitative, galvanized public opinion. It was a story tailor-made for the Roaring Twenties: youth versus corporate greed, the marvel of science versus the horror of industry, and a dramatic life-or-death race against time. The case, New Jersey versus U.S. Radium Corp., finally went to trial, but the women were frail. They could barely raise their arms to take an oath. Grace Fryer, the ringleader of the group, could only speak with difficulty. During the trial, the shocking truth of the cover-up was laid bare. Company officials had been using safe equipment themselves for years, had received multiple warnings from external experts, and had actively pressured doctors to attribute the women's illnesses to other causes. The company knew it was administering a slow, painful death. Facing overwhelming public pressure and the undeniable scientific evidence presented by Dr. Martland, the U.S. Radium Corporation finally agreed to settle the case out of court, just 2 days before the judge was due to rule. The company agreed to pay all medical and legal expenses for the rest of their lives. This was a groundbreaking victory. In the history of occupational hazard law, it was one of the first times an American corporation was held accountable for the health and safety of its workers due to industrial poisoning. The enduring legacy of the glow. The victory came late. The women, including Grace Fryer, died within a few years of the settlement, their graves sealed with lead to prevent the lingering radiation from escaping the soil. But their legacy glowed brighter than the paint on the dials. The story of the Radium Girls did not just affect the dial painting industry, it was a watershed moment in U.S. labor history. The birth of occupational health law. The Radium Girls case was directly responsible for the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, standards and guidelines for handling hazardous materials decades later. It provided the legal precedent that an employer is fully responsible for the health and safety of their workforce. Radium as a known danger. The public awareness generated by the trial led to the ban of radium in consumer products. The glamorous, undark age ended, replaced by a sobering, scientific understanding of radiation danger. The rise of the whistleblower. The women and their attorneys paved the way for future workers to challenge powerful corporations by demonstrating that ordinary citizens could fight back against deliberate corporate negligence. Today, nearly a century later, if you visit the graves of the Radium Girls, their bodies, contained within their sealed coffins, are still faintly radioactive, a permanent, shocking monument to the sacrifices they made. They were not just victims. They were the courageous, glowing pioneers who forced America to reckon with the moral cost of the Industrial Revolution and set the standard for worker protection that all Americans benefit from today. Their story is a powerful reminder that some of the greatest shifts in American law began with the quiet bravery of a few young women who simply wanted justice for their stolen health. It is January 15, 1919, in Boston, Massachusetts. The Great War is over, the Spanish flu is finally receding, and America is bracing for the grim reality of Prohibition, which will be ratified just one day later. But today is a strangely warm, unseasonable day. The thermometer has jumped from frigid winter temperatures into the low 40s. The residents of the North End, mostly Italian immigrants and dock workers, are enjoying the momentary reprieve from the cold, taking their lunch break and strolling near the waterfront. Then, at precisely 12:40 p.m., the world turns into a nightmare wrapped in a sweet, thick blanket of brown. Imagine a sound so loud it is mistaken for a roaring elevated train or even machine gun fire, followed by a shockwave that makes the ground tremble. In the span of a single breath, the gigantic 50-foot-tall steel tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company, a storage container holding over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, ruptures. The steel plates tear away from the rivets with a shriek, launching pieces of metal like shrapnel through the bustling street. What follows is not a flood of water, but a terrifying 20-foot-high, 160-foot-wide tsunami of sticky, dark syrup sweeping across Commercial Street at an estimated speed of 35 miles per hour. This is the true story of the Great Molasses Flood, a catastrophe so absurd, so sudden, and so devastating, it became a defining yet darkly comical tragedy of American industrial history. The Great Brown Wave. The tank, 50 feet high and 90 feet across, sat next to the elevated railway and the city's Engine 31 firehouse, a mammoth landmark in the heart of the working-class community. The molasses inside was not for baking cookies. It was industrial grade, destined to be fermented into ethanol for use in both alcohol, rum, and, crucially, for munitions for the recently concluded World War I. The tank had been hastily and poorly built by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, whose rush to stockpile valuable alcohol before Prohibition became law had tragically bypassed all safety checks. The moment the tank gave way, the dense, massive wall of molasses struck. The sheer destructive force,
The weight of 13,000 tons of syrup delivered an impact equivalent to a freight train. The Engine 31 firehouse was literally lifted off its foundation, twisted, and then collapsed into a pile of rubble, trapping firemen inside. The steel girders of the nearby Boston Elevated Railway were bent and twisted as if they were wires. One section of the track was knocked entirely off its supports, and a train car was derailed. A 5-ton Mack truck was picked up and slammed into a nearby building. Buildings were crushed, windows were blown out 15 feet up, and utility poles were snapped in half. But the most immediate horror was reserved for the people and animals caught in the torrent. The molasses struck without warning, a silent, all-encompassing force that was impossible to outrun. Witnesses would later recall scenes of unbelievable tragedy. Anthony DeStasio, a young boy walking home with his sister, Maria, was swept up by the wave and carried on its crest, describing the surreal experience of surfing on the syrup before he was grounded. Maria and another child, Pasquale Jantosca, were less fortunate, vanishing into the brown quicksand. The fate of the horses was particularly gruesome. Wagon horses, essential to the dockyard economy, were instantly overwhelmed. They struggled and thrashed, only succeeding in digging themselves deeper into the syrup, dying like so many flies on sticky flypaper, according to one newspaper. Police officers arriving on the scene were forced to execute the horses still visible, putting them out of their miserable, sticky existence. The quicksand of syrup. The initial wave of destruction was the beginning of the nightmare. The molasses was warm when it burst from the tank. New, warm molasses had been added to the older, colder batch the day before, speeding up the fermentation and the pressure that caused the rupture. But as the molasses hit the cold January air and the chilly streets of Boston, it rapidly cooled and thickened. What had been a fast-moving liquid instantly became a viscous, gelatinous trap. Survivors and victims were left submerged in waist-deep goo that behaved like quicksand, thickening around them and making rescue nearly impossible. A Boston Post reporter painted a grim picture. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed anywhere life was. The rescue effort was immediately hindered by the bizarre nature of the disaster. First responders stuck. The police, firefighters, and over 100 cadets from the Navy training ship, the USS Nantucket, docked nearby, struggled to wade through the thick, heavy substance. They themselves often became mired, needing to be pulled out. The amber trap. The molasses hardened quickly, especially at night when the temperature dropped. Rescuers described the victims as being trapped in amber, glued to the ground and covered in a thick, sweet coating that made them impossible to identify or move. One rescuer recalled accidentally pulling a man's arm off while trying to extract him from the hardening sludge. Suffocation. The vast majority of the 21 human fatalities were caused by suffocation, either directly drowned in the syrup or crushed by the debris that the wave carried. The cleanup effort to locate bodies took 4 grueling days, with some remains not being recovered until 4 months later when they were fished out of the frigid Boston harbor. The trial and the triumph of accountability. The aftermath was a legal and logistical mess. The USIA company, desperate to avoid responsibility, immediately launched a stunning campaign of disinformation. Their defense was that the explosion was not due to faulty construction, but was the result of anarchist sabotage, a bomb planted by Italian radicals from the North End, the very people who were the victims. This accusation tapped directly into the anti-immigrant prejudice common in the U.S. at the time, attempting to turn the victims into suspects. The families of the deceased and injured filed a massive class-action lawsuit against USIA. The case, which dragged on for 6 grueling years, was one of the first major tort cases against a large corporation in American history. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. The Massachusetts Superior Court assigned an auditor, Hugh Ogden, who amassed 45,000 pages of testimony from over 3,000 witnesses. Key facts revealed in the investigation cemented USIA's guilt. reckless construction. The man who oversaw the tank's design, Arthur Gell, was a financier, not an engineer, and could not read blueprints. The steel used in the tank was later found to be dangerously thin, only half the thickness necessary to contain the immense pressure of the molasses. The oozing tank. Locals had long complained that the tank groaned, leaked, and rattled, especially when it was freshly filled. In a stunning display of corporate negligence, Purity Distilling's only response to the leaks was to paint the tank brown to conceal the syrup leaking down its sides. Scientific proof. Expert testimony revealed that the rapid temperature change on that warm January day caused the molasses to expand significantly. The combination of thermal expansion and fermentation, which created CO2
Beasts of burden. They were the true horsepower of the war effort, essential for moving supplies and equipment in areas inaccessible to trucks. They served as draft animals, pulling wagons, field guns. Up to 6 to 12 animals were required for heavy artillery, and ambulances. They were also used as pack animals to carry ammunition, food, and other supplies to the front lines. Logistical backbone. Mules and horses were a critical part of the complex supply chain. Supplies moved by train to distribution points, and from there, the final, most dangerous leg of the journey to the frontline trenches was often completed by animal transport. Working the railways. Mules were even used to pull trolleys on the light railway systems established to move material and wounded soldiers through the trenches, with one mule being capable of drawing over 1,300 kilograms, 2,900 pounds of weight. Procurement and journey overseas. The United States was a vital supplier of these animals to the Allied war effort even before officially entering the war. Mass procurement. Between 1914 and 1918, the U.S. shipped nearly 1 million horses overseas and took another 182,000 with its own troops. Over 67,000 animals, horses and mules, were procured for the AEF alone. Missouri was a major supplier, with its famous Missouri mules. Remount depots. The Army Quartermaster Corps ran remount depots like Fort Reno, Oklahoma, and Front Royal, Virginia, to procure and train the animals. The training for mules and their handlers, known as mule skinners, initially lasted about 4 months, but was shortened during the war. Perilous voyages. After training, the animals were sent via train to ports such as West Wego, Louisiana, and loaded onto specialized transport ships. The journey across the Atlantic was treacherous, with animals suffering from seasickness, broken bones, and disease, like shipping fever, a form of pneumonia, from being tossed around in rough seas. Those that died were buried at sea. The cost of the war. The service of these animals came at a terrible price. Casualties. It's estimated that more than 8 million horses, mules, and donkeys died on all sides during World War I, many from the extreme conditions, shell fire, gas attacks, and disease. Around 20% of the animals brought from the U.S. were lost on enemy soil. A soldier's life. Like the soldiers, mules on the front lines worked long, continuous days. In extreme shortages, they were reportedly sometimes fed sawdust when grain was scarce. Forgotten heroes. After the armistice, most of the surviving American horses and mules were condemned and sold to the French government or to butchers, as the cost of shipping them back to the U.S. was deemed an unnecessary expense. Only a select few, often mascots or generals' prized animals, made the journey home. Notable American mule. One of the few mules to return home and gain recognition was Arizona, a mule from Missouri who served with the 30th Infantry of the 3rd Infantry Division, including fighting in the brutal Meuse-Argonne offensive. Arizona was wounded by shrapnel in the neck while dragging a field gun. He survived and returned to the Presidio of San Francisco, where he was fed and cared for. Years later, he was awarded a Medal of Honor in a ceremony in 1928, serving as a symbol for all the men and animals who had served. General John J. Pershing, commander of the AEF, himself acknowledged the supreme sacrifice, stating that the Army horses and mules proved of inestimable value in prosecuting the war to a successful conclusion.
One such mule was Arizona, despite being a Missouri mule, a powerful pack animal destined for the 30th Infantry of the 3rd Infantry Division. His crossing in the spring of 1918 was typical. He endured cramped, swaying stalls, the terror of unseen U-boat wakes, and the general misery of the sea. Upon arrival at the French ports of Saint-Nazaire or Brest, the stress did not end. Offloading the massive, seasick animals down narrow ramps and into the chaos of a foreign port was a job requiring immense patience and skill. Arizona and his comrades were then loaded onto French trains, often the diminutive specialized trench trains, and hauled hundreds of miles closer to the front. They were now entering the realm of perpetual darkness, mud, and endless noise. Part 3: The Mud and the Meat Grinder. The Western Front was a place where modern machinery failed and where the humble mule ascended to become a critical military asset. The terrain around the trenches was a thick, clinging morass of mud, water, and debris. It was here, in the final logistical mile, that the mule truly earned its legend. The pack train. The 30th Infantry Division, like many AEF units, relied on mule pack trains managed by the Quartermaster Corps' dedicated pack troops. A single mule could carry an incredible load: parts of a heavy machine gun, mortar tubes, medical supplies, or most critically, shells and ammunition. It often took 4 mules to carry a disassembled heavy machine gun and its ammunition, with each animal carrying a precisely balanced portion of the whole. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Arizona's unit was thrown into the massive, brutal Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the final, decisive American push of the war. The Argonne Forest was a labyrinth of shattered trees, unmapped ravines, and the deepest mud. Here, motor transport was utterly useless. The entire weight of the American advance, the food, the water, the artillery, the medical supplies, was entirely dependent on the mules. Ammunition and endurance. The mules hauled their loads for days on end, often without rest or proper feed. Diaries from the mule skinners recount the stench of the dead, both human and animal, and the heartbreaking necessity of forcing their exhausted mules forward. The animals were trained to ignore the roar of the French 75mm field guns they often towed, but nothing could prepare them for the random, horrific shell fire. One day in the Argonne, as Arizona was straining to drag a field gun into position for the 30th, the shrapnel arrived. A German shell burst nearby, and a jagged piece of steel found its mark, slamming into Arizona's neck. The mule staggered but did not fall. The men of the QMC Veterinary Corps, the unsung heroes of the animal army, worked under fire, their field hospitals often overwhelmed. In the hell of the front, they treated over 2.5 million animals, managing to save and return to service over 2 million of them. They had to learn to differentiate between the simple physical fatigue and the very real psychological trauma known as shell shock that plagued the more sensitive horses. Mules, with their stoic nature, were less prone to the worst psychological effects, but the physical injuries were devastating. Despite the best efforts, 20% of the animals sent to France by the AEF were killed or died of disease. Arizona was one of the fortunate few. Dragged from the line, his wound was dressed and he was nursed back to health, a veteran now marked by a permanent scar. Part 4: The Great Betrayal. November 11, 1918. The armistice brought jubilation to the trenches and relief to the exhausted animals. The war was over. For the human soldiers, the promise was a return home, but for the vast majority of the Great Mule Army, the armistice was the ultimate betrayal. The U.S. government, facing the monumental cost of demobilization, made a cold, economic decision. It was too expensive to ship the animals home. The final auction. Almost the entire surviving population of American horses and mules, tens of thousands of animals that had endured the voyage, the mud, the disease, and the shrapnel, were condemned by the QMC and sold off in private, unsentimental auctions. They were purchased primarily by French and Belgian farmers to help rebuild their ravaged farmlands, or worse, sold to butchers for horse and mule meat to feed the struggling civilian populations. The human handlers, the mule skinners, who had bonded with their teams over years of shared danger and suffering, were heartbroken, forced to watch their comrades in arms be sold to a devastating, unknown fate. The mascots and the exceptions. Only a tiny fraction of the animals, primarily highly decorated mascots, or the personal mounts of senior officers, were deemed worthy of the expense of the return trip. Arizona was one of these exceptions. His survival of a shrapnel wound and his consistent, heroic service with the 30th Infantry had made him a celebrity within the regiment. The men rallied to his cause, and the mule was spared the auction block. Epilogue: The Triumphant Return of Arizona. Arizona returned to the United States and was transported across the country to the Presidio of San Francisco, where he served out his days as a beloved Army mascot. He was showered with affection, fed well, and treated with the dignity he had earned. The final, incredible moment of his story came nearly a decade later. On February 16, 1928, an elaborate official ceremony was held at the Presidio. Standing stiffly on parade, the aging mule, Arizona, was officially decorated for his service. He was awarded a special Medal of Honor for having been wounded in action at the Meuse-Argonne. The ceremony was a quiet, necessary act of public recognition, a single moment of justice for the tens of thousands of mules whose sacrifice had been erased by a stroke of a bureaucratic pen. The story of the Great Mule Army is a testament to the fact that wars are not won by technology alone, but by logistics and the endurance of living things. The American doughboys fought bravely, but it was their silent, stoic, stubborn comrade, the American mule, that gave them the shells, the food, and the essential supplies they needed to fight. The QMC's massive animal logistical operation was the unseen miracle of the AEF, a forgotten 2 million horsepower engine that delivered victory on the Western Front. But manual labor wasn't enough for Claudio's restless spirit. He moved to the continental U.S., migrating through California before following the seasonal jobs to the icy salmon canneries of Alaska. By 1916, he had settled in Sparks, Nevada, a dusty railway town adjacent to Reno. Here, he achieved a milestone. He graduated from Clark Held's Business College and secured a respectable clerical job at the city post office. Claudio was forging a new American life, a quiet, diligent immigrant success story. Then, the world changed. When the U.S. declared war on Germany in April 1917, the vast majority of Filipinos, including Claudio, were in a unique and frustrating legal limbo. As residents of an unincorporated territory of the United States, they were nationals, not citizens. This meant they owed allegiance to the American flag, but were denied the fundamental rights and protections of citizenship. For many, military service became a desperate path to legitimacy. If they fought and bled for America, how could America continue to deny them their rightful place? Claudio, described as being fired by the spirit of brotherhood, was determined to join the fight for global democracy. He applied to the U.S. Army twice and was initially denied, perhaps due to bureaucratic uncertainty over his national status or simply the logistical chaos of the burgeoning military. But Tomas was persistent. On November 2, 1917, he was finally enlisted, becoming a private in the U.S. Army. He was quickly assigned to the 41st Infantry Division and within weeks was on a troopship bound for the greatest meat grinder in human history, the trenches of France. Part 2. The Trenches of the Big Red One. Claudio's journey across the Atlantic was standard for the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, yet extraordinary for a Filipino national. He landed in France and was soon transferred to the 28th Infantry Regiment of the famed U.S. Army's 1st Division, the Big Red One, a unit that would become synonymous with America's fighting spirit. The 1st Division was immediately thrown into the most brutal fighting. The German spring offensives of 1918 were designed to break the Allied lines before the American Army could fully mobilize. American troops were rushed to plug holes in the demoralized French and British fronts, and the 1st Division was tasked with the critical offensive at Cantigny. Cantigny, May 28, 1918, a test of fire. The Battle of Cantigny was the first major American offensive of World War I. It was a baptism by fire that demonstrated to the world and to the skeptical European allies that the young American troops could fight and hold ground. Private Claudio, operating deep within the maelstrom, experienced the true horror of trench warfare, artillery fire that literally reshaped the landscape, the sickening rattle of machine guns, and the nerve-shredding anxiety of counterattacks. The attack on Cantigny was successful, but the cost was immense. As American forces dug in to hold their newly won position, the Germans responded with heavy counter-battery fire. It was during this ferocious defense, likely on May 28th or shortly after, that Private Claudio was severely wounded. The historical record indicates his injuries were catastrophic. He was evacuated from the line and transported to a field hospital behind the lines near Chateau Thierry. For over a month, he fought for his life in a world of mud, tetanus, and fleeting hope. On June 29, 1918, Tomas Mateo Claudio died from his wounds. He was the first known Filipino soldier to die in World War I, and the first Filipino-American combat casualty. He paid the ultimate price, a national of an American territory dying for a democratic ideal on French soil. Part 3. The Missing Medal of Honor. Claudio's death was immediately recognized by his comrades and the U.S. Army Command. He was cited for gallantry in action by the headquarters of the 1st Division in General Orders No. 1, issued on January 1, 1920. However, the true measure of his sacrifice and the enduring mystery of his story lies in the shadows of the highest U.S. military honor, the Medal of Honor. While there is no definitive, publicly available record indicating Claudio was officially recommended for the Medal of Honor, the extraordinary circumstances of Filipino valor in the AEF, combined with a significant historical footnote, suggest his actions were in the category of American heroes like Sergeant Alvin York, who also performed his legendary feat in the Meuse Argonne. The Philippine National Guard and the Promise. When the U.S. entered the war, the Philippine government, eager to prove its loyalty and capacity for self-governance, immediately raised a Philippine National Guard of 25,000 men. This force was offered to the U.S. military, but due to internal politics and logistical concerns, was ultimately kept in the Philippines and never deployed to Europe. Those Filipinos who did fight, like Claudio, were mostly expatriate laborers who had traveled to the U.S. mainland and enlisted directly. These volunteers were driven by two main motivations: patriotism and the hope for full American citizenship, a goal achieved only after the war and only in fits and starts. Their bravery was repeatedly noted. For example, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Filipino soldiers repeatedly took extraordinary risks. The sheer logistical difficulty and the fact that most Filipinos were assigned to labor battalions or service roles meant that those who saw combat, like Claudio in the infantry, were anomalies. The lost citation and the buried record. Historical accounts confirm that several Asian Americans and non-citizen soldiers performed acts of heroism that likely warranted the Medal of Honor, only to be overlooked due to systemic discrimination and the bureaucratic chaos of war. Many of these awards were only rectified decades later, such as the widespread review that occurred in the 1990s. Tomas Claudio's initial award of a citation for gallantry was a rare official acknowledgement for an enlisted Filipino national in a frontline combat division. The possibility exists that the records of his action, which occurred in the ferocious environment of the 1st Division's first major engagement, were lost, minimized, or simply not pursued for the highest honor because of his non-citizen status. He died before the war's conclusion, eliminating the chance of a celebrity-driven campaign for recognition that helped establish the legacy of men like Alvin York. Part 4. The Repatriation and Enduring Legacy. Claudio's story did not end in a French cemetery. 3 years after his death, in a powerful act of recognition that crossed the Pacific, his remains were repatriated to the Philippines. On November 14, 1921, his body was interred with full military honors in the Manila North Cemetery. The outpouring of national pride in the Philippines was immense. He was instantly transformed into a symbol of Filipino courage and an argument for national independence. His story was used to cement the deep emotional connection between the Philippines and the United States, a bond forged in mutual sacrifice. A college in his hometown of Morong was named after him, Tomas Claudio Memorial College. Streets, bridges, and military camps in the Philippines still bear his name. The Filipino people enshrined him as the first Filipino to die for the cause of world democracy in World War I. While the U.S. ultimately granted citizenship to Filipino veterans decades later, Private Tomas Mateo Claudio's service in the 1st Division, the Big Grand One, stands as a powerful, surprising historical anomaly. His story challenges the popular narrative of who the doughboys of World War I were. They were not all farm boys from Tennessee or factory workers from New York. They were also brave, non-citizen nationals like Claudio, who crossed the planet, gave their lives in America's first major battle, and cemented their loyalty in the mud of France centuries before they were recognized as fully American. Tomas Claudio's saga is more than a historical footnote. It is a profound lesson in the American mosaic. It serves as a reminder that the cost of American freedom has been paid for by countless unseen individuals fighting under the stars and stripes for the chance to be called American, a right many only earned through the ultimate sacrifice. He was the first, and his heroic death demands that his name be remembered alongside the great American heroes of the Meuse-Argonne. The year is 1919. The world is catching its breath after the cataclysm of the First World War, and at its center stands President Woodrow Wilson, the towering intellectual figure who had championed a revolutionary concept of the League of Nations. Wilson believed this international body was the only way to ensure lasting global peace, the capstone of his peace without victory doctrine. Yet back home, a fierce battle raged in the U.S. Senate, led by the formidable Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, over ratifying the Treaty of Versailles and joining the League. Exhausted, physically frail, and deeply frustrated by the political opposition, Wilson embarked on a grueling 8,000-mile, 22-day whistle-stop tour across the American West. His aim was to bypass the Senate and appeal directly to the American people, whom he believed would demand the treaty's ratification. This tour